right. Well, another edition of Tech on Ice. Hope everybody's having a great day. Um, Something a little bit top of mind because I've been reworking my link shortener, and I was thinking about rebuilding it and all of that sort of stuff. And I was thinking of what sort of solution I wanted to build. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about a pattern for building apps called event-driven architecture, or EDA. I think a lot of folks probably understand the premise, but I want to just give it its flowers and talk about how great it is from a concept perspective. Like, for a little bit of history, like, we've all built apps that more or less are dependent on something else happening. They might be something like an HTTP request is an event, um, something getting a row getting inserted into a database, file being dropped somewhere. And how we used to do stuff like this, especially if we're building apps in .NET or apps in Java or whatever, is that like we would have like a polling service, like something that runs on a machine that is doing like constantly checking for changes. When it's like, oh, it's checking a file share for files being dropped in there, or it's looking at database records and seeing if database records have been updated, or what have you, right? So we've been building like apps like this, like apps that are driven by something happening, and then we do some business logic, move data around or what have you, data transformation or kicking off other workflows or what have you. So that approach to building apps, it has a name. It's called event-driven architecture. But now we're at a point in the last 5 years, maybe even 10 years, probably, about how there are tools in place to not have to build like a while loop, right? Because at the end of the day, like, a lot of this stuff is triggered by while loops, or maybe if it's fancy, there's like webhooks or something. So like all of the major like cloud providers have like a solution in this space. Like, there's Azure Functions or AWS Lambda or Google Cloud Runner. And basically the idea is that like that this concept of triggers, right? Where something triggers an event, and then you have some code that runs whenever that event is triggered. And you have scope and you have context and you have all these sort of things. But what I think is really, really valuable is like how many times have we ever built an app that wasn't driven by an event occurring? I mean, I was trying to think about this the other day. It's like, I've written like apps in my life that's like literally like a text, like a button. Like, it's a client app or a web app that has a button on it, and that button would then do a bunch of stuff, right? Like, and I can't think of one example in my professional career where I've built something that wasn't dependent on something else happening. Even if that one thing is happening is a user going to the application and making changes or going to a specific part of the website. And I don't want to say that like everything is event driven, but like a lot of the stuff in the business world or enterprise world is very event driven, because at the end of the day, like, we're trying to move value from one part of the business to another part of the business, right? Whether it's moving data around or processing data from a partner or an external vendor. So what does that mean in the world of building today's apps? So I'm just going to use the one that the framework or the service that I used the most was Azure Functions. Lambda, I've used Lambda, I've used Cloud Runner to an extent as well, but I feel most comfortable with Azure Functions. So like the idea that, okay, so whenever a file gets dropped into Azure Blob Storage, I want to take that file and I want to process it and insert it into a database, right? Like, in Azure Functions world, there's this idea of triggers, which basically dropping a file into Azure Blob Storage, and there's bindings. So being able to basically map the connection between where it is coming from and where it's going. So you don't have to wire up all of that connective tissue yourself. So it's really valuable, right? And I think event-driven architecture, like, we're seeing it more and more now, especially like as scale is important, cost is important, because these things are fairly cost effective too. Like, they're not always running, they're waiting for events to happen, and then you have some framework that basically initiates that little chunk of code from running. Also, from like a maintainability perspective, like not having to build all of this stuff from hand is super valuable, like because there's great SDKs, and there's great libraries, and there's frameworks to be able to accomplish these things. Yeah, like that's in a nutshell. Like I think event-driven architecture is really cool. I highly recommend you take a look at it. You don't need to be running in the cloud to do these sort of things, but it makes it a lot easier. But I would love to hear like down in the chat, like throw down below, like when was the last time you built something that wasn't event-driven, or on the flip side of that, like how often do you build apps that are event-driven? I'd love to hear it. Feel free to shout it out down below in the comments. And also, like as always, like and subscribe. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.